Jessie Trail is now recognised as one of the most important artists producing prints in the 20th century. When you look at these works, you realise that Jessie Trail is in fact the most important, the most experimental, the most vigorous of all the printmakers working in Australia in that time. Jessie Trail first studied printmaking in Australia, so she was quite unusual in that way. She learned from John Mather. She then went to England, where she studied with Frank Brangwyn. She came back to Australia as a fully formed printmaker, having exhibited at the Royal Academy, having exhibited at the French Salon, and also in America. So when she came back to Australia, and when at the time of the formation of the Australian Painter Etcher Society, she was the most experienced etcher in Australia. There's two facets of her work. One was the landscape. She was a Christian and she believed that it was God-given and it should be protected, it should be looked after, and it shouldn't be frittered away. She lived at Berwick, which is just outside of Melbourne. She was there amongst the trees. Her little studio, and it's still there today, is sitting amongst those tall trees, and from that place, that's where she observed the landscape. She observed people ploughing the fields. She walked through those forests, and this comes out in all her works. There's a key work which is called Man and Nature, and it talks about the landscape as a gift to us, and then the destruction of the landscape, the burning of the landscape, and then, of course, this is to make fields, and then sowing those fields and reaping them, and this is the reward, the wheat that's grown on that landscape. So she didn't, even though she was an early conservationist, she wasn't a person who just said, no, we can't do anything to that landscape. But she was incredibly critical of people who cleared the land and then let blackberries grow on it, for instance. She was horrified by that aspect of the use of land. The other thing was the building of things like the Sydney Harbour Bridge, which was one of her central preoccupations in the 1920s. These were large scale, very bold, very decorative. They changed in their format to follow the sort of subject matter, whether it be long and narrow or tall. But in all of them, she draws the structure of the bridge in great detail. In this way, she's been talked about as being one of the modernist artists. In a sense, she was producing etchings about a modern subject, but they weren't modernist in the way that artists like Grace Cossington-Smith were. She's more of a modernist like the photographer Casno was, as distinct from the modernism of Max de Payne's photographs of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. If you look at her work, the defining feature is incredible control over tonal processes. She uses aquatint a great deal, particularly in her later works, where she really shows she was in complete command of that very, very difficult technique. A work like Good Night in the Gullies, where the white gum grows, from the early 1920s, is an extraordinary example of controlled use of aquatint on a very large scale, and it is one of the largest prints produced in Australia between 1900 and 1950. In her lifetime, Jessie Trail's prints weren't collected very often by art galleries, and in fact she felt badly done by, and she gave works to libraries instead. So in the 1970s, it was only then that people started to buy works, and the National Gallery of Australia, bought their first works in the early 70s. Since that time, we've been building up a collection of her work, and we've now got over 100 works, which is the largest collection assembled. And this is what this exhibition is drawn from. So this is the first time that such a wide range of her work has ever been on display, from the works that she first did in the early 1900s right through to her last works in 1955. And it covers all her major subjects as well, the landscape and those wonderful Sydney Harbour Bridge prints.